Today is April 28, 2026. 30 years ago today, on April 28, 1996, a lone gunman walked into a cafe at the Port Arthur historic site in Tasmania, pulled a semi-automatic rifle from a bag, and opened fire on tourists. Within 2 minutes, 20 people were dead. By the end of that day, 35 people had been killed and 23 more injured. It was the deadliest mass shooting in Australian history, and it changed this country forever. Today we're going to talk about what happened at Port Arthur, how Australia responded, what that response achieved, and why 30 years later, the debate over gun laws is still very much alive. Port Arthur is a historic site on the Tasman Peninsula in southeast Tasmania. In the 1800s it was a convict settlement. By 1996 it was one of Australia's most popular tourist destinations. Families, couples, international visitors, all coming to see the ruins of this piece of Australian history. On the morning of April 28, 1996, a 28-year-old man from Hobart drove to the site. He first killed the owners of a nearby guest house. He then drove to Port Arthur, sat down at the Broad Arrow Cafe, and began shooting. The attack was relentless. In and around the cafe, at a nearby car park, at a toll booth, along the road. The gunman killed 35 people before police surrounded the guest house, and, after a standoff lasting through the night, captured him as he fled the building the next morning. The victims included families on holiday, couples, a mother and her 2 young daughters, aged 3 and 6. People from Australia, Japan, and other countries, who simply happened to be there that day. Justin Noble, a former NSW police officer, who was on holiday at Port Arthur with his wife, later described what he experienced as absolute terror. He remembered strangers clinging to him, desperate to survive. He has lived with those memories for 30 years. Dr. Brian Walpole, who was working in the emergency department at Royal Hobart Hospital that day, described it as like going to war for a day. He said the scale of what arrived at his hospital was unlike anything he had ever seen before. What happened next is the part of this story that Australia is most often cited for internationally. 12 days after the massacre, Prime Minister John Howard stood up and announced the National Firearms Agreement, a sweeping set of gun law reforms that would be implemented nationally. With bipartisan support from both the Coalition and Labor, the reforms were extraordinary in their speed and scope. Semi-automatic and pump-action rifles and shotguns were banned for civilian use. Strict new licensing and registration requirements were introduced, including a 28-day waiting period for all firearm purchases, and the government launched a mandatory gun buyback scheme. In the months that followed, around 640,000 to 700,000 firearms were handed in by Australian gun owners and destroyed. The government paid fair market value. It was one of the largest civilian disarmament programs in peacetime history. The political courage required to do this was significant. Howard wore a bulletproof vest to address a rally of angry gun owners in regional Victoria. He was booed, he was threatened, he did it anyway, and the results, over the following decades, were dramatic. In the 15 years before Port Arthur, Australia experienced at least one mass shooting, defined as 5 or more victims every single year. In the nearly 30 years since the reforms were introduced, there has not been a single mass shooting using the types of firearms that were banned. Now 30 years on, where do things actually stand? Here's a number that surprises a lot of people. Australia currently has more than 4.1 million registered firearms. That is roughly 25% more than existed before the Port Arthur massacre in 1996. How is that possible after a major gun buyback and tightened laws? The answer is population growth and the types of firearms involved. Australia's population has grown by almost 50% since 1996. From around 18 million to about 28 million. The number of firearms has grown by 25%. So on a per capita basis, there are actually fewer guns per person than before Port Arthur. Tom Kenyon, the CEO of the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, makes this point regularly. He argues that every legal firearm in Australia today has been purchased under strict regulation, licensing, waiting periods, checks. The legal gun market, he says, is tightly controlled. But critics point out that the composition of firearms has shifted. There are more handguns, more lever action, shotguns, and more rifles than in 1996. And the question of whether the current laws are keeping pace with the risks is one that gun safety advocates say urgently needs attention. The 30th anniversary of Port Arthur is landing at a particularly charged moment in Australian gun law history. In December 2025, Australia experienced its worst mass shooting since Port Arthur. 15 people were killed in an attack at Bondi Beach that targeted the Jewish community. The attack reignited a fierce national debate about whether Australia's gun laws are still fit for purpose. In response, all states and territories have agreed to consider tightening laws. But the approach has been far from uniform. New South Wales, Western Australia, and the ACT have either implemented or are seriously considering gun caps for individuals, limits on how many firearms a single person can legally own. These states argue that there is no legitimate reason for a civilian to own large numbers of firearms. Tasmania, however, has ruled out a gun cap, and Walter Micak, whose wife Nanette and daughters Madeline and Alana were among those murdered at Port Arthur 30 years ago, described Tasmania's position as pathetic. Micak has spent 3 decades advocating for gun safety. He established a foundation in his daughters' names, and on the 30th anniversary of the day he lost his family, he is still fighting the same fight, still pushing for the laws to be strong enough to prevent what happened to him from happening to anyone else. There's an international dimension to this story that's worth understanding. Australia's response to Port Arthur is studied around the world, particularly in the United States, where mass shootings happen with horrifying regularity, and where gun reform efforts have repeatedly stalled. Australian researchers have published extensive analyses of the impact of the 1996 reforms. The findings show a significant decline in firearm homicide rates, in firearm suicide rates, and in mass shooting incidents involving the types of weapons that were banned. Critics of the Australian model argue that direct comparisons with the United States are misleading. Different cultures, different constitutional frameworks, different histories with firearms. And that's fair. Australia's National Firearms Agreement worked, in part because it had genuine bipartisan political support. That kind of consensus is much harder to achieve in other political environments. But the core lesson that Australia demonstrated in 1996 is still cited by public health researchers around the world, that when governments act decisively after mass casualty events, and when they implement evidence-based reforms with political will, the data shows those reforms save lives. 30 years on, the 35 victims of Port Arthur are remembered today at services across Australia. The Prime Minister released a statement calling the massacre a terrible, indiscriminate cruelty that remains beyond understanding. He acknowledged the courage of survivors, first responders, and everyone whose lives were shattered by what happened. The Broad Arrow Cafe at Port Arthur, where the shooting began, was demolished in the years after the massacre. In its place stands a roofless shell, walls preserved, interior open to the sky as a memorial. People leave flowers there, they leave notes, they stand in silence. 30 years is a long time. But for the survivors, for the families, for the first responders who were there that day, it is not so long at all. Australia changed on April 28, 1996. The question the 30th anniversary raises is whether we are still willing to do what it takes to keep it that way. Do you have memories of where you were when you heard about Port Arthur? Or thoughts on where Australia's gun laws stand today? I'd genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. Like and subscribe for more Australian stories told simply. See you next time.